The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast harsh shadows across Scarlett's bruised face as she lay motionless in the hospital bed, machines beeping steadily around her like a mechanical heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. Her stepfather Thomas had unleashed his worst this time. 4 broken ribs, a severe concussion, internal bleeding, a fractured left wrist, and cigarette burns scattered across her arms like constellations of cruelty. And as she drifted between consciousness and darkness, she could hear the nurses whispering about the mysterious man who called every 30 minutes demanding updates, his voice carrying an authority that made even seasoned medical professionals tremble. She didn't know that Vincent Moretti had already mobilized his entire organization, 400 of his most trusted soldiers receiving orders through encrypted channels while he stood in his penthouse office, staring out at Boston, the city that bowed to his will with nothing more than a whisper of his name. The call had come at midnight, his informant at the hospital breathless with fear, as she described the condition of the woman Vincent had been quietly protecting for 8 months, the woman who didn't even know she had captured the attention of the most dangerous man on the entire eastern seaboard. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had spent weeks orchestrating ways to approach her naturally, to win her trust without revealing the darkness that followed him like a second skin, only to discover that the real monster in her life had been hiding in plain sight behind the facade of a respectable accountant and loving stepfather. Thomas Webb's background check had come back pristine. No criminal record, no outstanding debts, no red flags that would have marked him as a threat. But Vincent should have looked deeper, should have seen past the suburban disguise to the twisted soul that had been systematically destroying Scarlett for 15 years, ever since her mother died and left her defenseless at the age of 12. He had first noticed her 8 months ago at the coffee shop she managed downtown, a small place called Morning Bloom, where she poured her exhaustion into perfect lattes and genuine smiles, drawn initially by the warmth in her eyes despite the sadness that clung to her like a permanent shadow. Day after day, he had found excuses to stop by under the name Marcus, ordering black coffees he barely touched just to hear her laugh, to watch the way she handled difficult customers with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, to study the subtle way she flinched whenever someone raised their voice too quickly or moved their hands too suddenly. Those little signs should have told him everything. But he had been too caught up in the unfamiliar sensation of wanting something he couldn't simply take, someone who needed to be approached with patience rather than power, someone who carried the weight of a dying sister on her shoulders while hiding bruises beneath long sleeves and fabricated smiles. Scarlett represented everything his world had taught him to exploit or destroy: innocence, hope, the stubborn belief that good people existed and deserved protection, and yet she had become the one thing he would burn down cities to preserve. The one light in 20 years of darkness that made him remember what it felt like to be human. If Scarlett's story has touched your heart, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens when the most dangerous man in Boston discovers the monster hiding in plain sight. Vincent set his phone down on the table. His eyes remained fixed on the Boston night beyond the glass. Yet his mind was somewhere else. In the cold hospital room where Scarlett lay suspended between life and death, he could feel the anger rising in his chest like volcanic magma waiting to erupt, a raw and merciless force he had believed long buried now awakening with a strength that startled even him. He lifted the phone again, this time not to listen but to command, and when Lorenzo Santini answered on the first ring, his voice was as cold as winter ice. Lorenzo, his most loyal lieutenant for 15 years, the man who had helped him build the empire from the ashes of a gang war, immediately knew something was wrong, because Vincent never called at this hour unless someone was about to die. "I need 400 men assembled within 1 hour," Vincent said slowly, each word as if carved in stone. "The target is Mercy General Hospital. Seal off the entire area. Not a single fly goes in or out without my permission." Lorenzo didn't ask why. He didn't ask what had happened. Because after all these years, he knew that when Vincent Moretti spoke in that voice, questions were a luxury no one could afford. "Yes, sir." Lorenzo replied briefly and ended the call. Within minutes, the encrypted communication network of the Moretti organization lit up like a vast nervous system being activated. Messages flowed through every tier, from senior captains to street soldiers, each receiving precise instructions about rally points, cover attire, and specific roles for the night's operation. Men sleeping bolted upright in their beds. Men in nightclubs slipped quietly into the shadows. Men guarding business fronts handed over their posts to replacements. All moved like parts of a colossal machine running with perfect precision. Vincent stepped into the dressing room. He removed the shirt stained with blood from the whiskey glass he had crushed when he heard the news, and replaced it with a perfectly tailored 3-piece black suit, the uniform he always wore when preparing to face an enemy. He looked into the mirror and saw the reflection of a 36-year-old man with eyes cold as steel and features sharp as if carved from granite. Yet tonight there was something else in them, a low burning fire that anyone could read as the warning of a coming storm. When the private elevator carried him down to the basement, the motorcade was already waiting. 6 gleaming black sedans stood in line with engines running, drivers rigid beside their doors like silent statues. Lorenzo waited by the first car, his familiar, impassive face hiding only barely restrained curiosity. And as Vincent approached, he merely nodded and opened the door for his boss. 400 men are on the way, Lorenzo reported once they were inside. The first wave will reach the hospital within 20 minutes. I've divided them into 4 groups, according to the standard plan. Vincent nodded, eyes forward as the convoy rolled out of the garage and slid into the Boston night like a massive black serpent gliding toward its prey. One more thing, Vincent said after a moment of silence, his voice dropping so low Lorenzo had to lean closer to hear. Get me everything on Thomas Webb. I want to know what he eats, where he sleeps, what he fears, and most of all where he's being held tonight. Lorenzo acknowledged with a brief nod, and as he raised his phone to deploy a separate investigative unit, Vincent turned back to the window where streetlights streaked past like pale smears of light in the dark. She will never be afraid again, he swore to himself, and anyone who had touched her would learn what hell on earth truly meant. Mercy General Hospital rose out of the night like a castle of light in a sea of darkness, its countless illuminated windows reflecting into the Boston sky like a giant lighthouse that never slept. The first wave had arrived 15 minutes before Vincent's convoy. 50 men in expensive suits and polished leather briefcases walking into the main lobby with the easy confidence of lawyers and businessmen visiting relatives, dispersing into strategic positions so naturally that no one suspected a thing. Some sitting at the lobby cafe, some lingering near the reception desk, others occupying the waiting chairs by the elevators, and in less than 10 minutes every main entrance was under their quiet surveillance. The second wave came in, ambulances and medical transport vans bearing fake logos convincing enough to fool security. 80 men, dressed as nurses, technicians, and janitorial staff slipping seamlessly into the hospital's late-night rhythm, taking over empty corridors, fire stairwells, and blind corners beyond the reach of security cameras. They moved with the precision of people thoroughly trained, each knowing exactly where to stand and what to do, and when a real nurse passed by they smiled and nodded as if they had worked there for years. The third wave was the most striking display. 120 men in full black tactical gear pouring out of SUVs parked along 3 surrounding blocks, securing nearby rooftops, underground garages, emergency entrances, and establishing a security perimeter so tight that not even a bird could cross unnoticed. The rest, more than 150 elite fighters, were positioned at key points across the city, ready to respond to any unforeseen development, a reserve force Vincent always kept in hand like a card he never had to play but that always made his enemies cautious. The 7th floor, where Scarlett lay in room 714, was sealed with astonishing subtlety. 2 men in hospital security uniforms took over the stairwells, 2 more controlled the elevators, and a 5-man team stood watch just outside the corridor leading to her room, all armed beneath their coats and fitted with wireless earpieces. When Vincent's convoy stopped at the rear VIP entrance, Lorenzo received the final report through his earpiece and turned to his boss with a rare trace of satisfaction on his normally stone-cold face. All set, sir, he said. The entire hospital is under our control. There are no signs of anything unusual. The local police have been handled. They believe this is a federal witness protection operation and have agreed to keep their distance. Vincent stepped out of the car, the polished leather of his shoes touching the damp pavement, and as he walked toward the back entrance, his men stood lined along both sides like guarding statues, their heads lowered in silent respect. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to, because he knew every one of the 400 warriors there that night was ready to die on his command without a single question, a loyalty forged by blood and time that money could never buy. Mercy General Hospital, once neutral ground belonging to no underworld power, had now become the fortress of Vincent Moretti, and anyone who dared enter it with hostile intent would soon understand they had stepped into the territory of the most terrifying predator the city had ever known. Dr. Margaret Chen had worked at Mercy General for 20 years, and she had seen everything a large city hospital could offer, from gang shootings to catastrophic emergency cases after traffic accidents, yet she had never in her life seen anything like what was unfolding tonight. She sensed something was wrong when she passed through the main lobby at 3 a.m. and noticed far too many men in suits for a hospital at that hour. And when she went up to the 7th floor to check on a patient admitted the night before, she discovered 2 unfamiliar security guards posted at the stairwell, faces she had never seen in 2 decades of working here. She was about to call the hospital director when a tall man with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as razors stepped in front of her, his expression professionally polite, yet carrying something in his gaze that made her instinctively take a step back. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Dr. Chen," the man said in a voice that was warm but carried unmistakable authority. "My name is Lorenzo Santini. I represent a federal agency whose identity I can't disclose, and we're conducting an emergency protection operation for one of your patients, Scarlett Hayes, in room 714. Margaret Chen wasn't easily intimidated. She had faced drunken thugs and aggressive addicts without flinching. Yet there was something about this man that told her this wasn't a conversation she could win. "Which federal agency?" she asked bluntly, her voice retaining the firmness of someone used to giving orders. "And why haven't I received any official notice before you turned my hospital into a military base?" Lorenzo smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and drew from his inner pocket a stack of documents that looked very official, stamped and signed in ways she couldn't possibly verify at this hour of the night. "The urgency of the situation didn't allow us to go through normal channels," Lorenzo explained as Margaret flipped through the pages. "The man who attacked Miss Hayes didn't act alone. He's connected to very dangerous people, and we have reason to believe they'll try to silence her before she can testify. I'm sure you saw her condition when she was admitted. Would you want anything worse to happen to her?" Margaret remembered the image of the young woman brought into the emergency room the night before. Her face so bruised it was almost impossible to recognize her features, cigarette burns scattered across her arms like evidence of years of cruelty, and her heart tightened at the thought that someone might want to hurt her again. She looked up at Lorenzo, into eyes that remained cold and unmoved, and she knew that whether the story was true or not, these men weren't going to leave just because she asked. "I want to make sure no other patients are affected," she said after a moment of silence, her tone carrying the compromise of someone who knows when to choose her battles. "And you mustn't interfere with the medical staff's work." Lorenzo nodded respectfully, this time seeming more sincere. "Of course, Dr. Chen. We're here only to protect, not to cause trouble. You can go on with your duties as usual and pretend we don't exist." Margaret Chen knew she was lying to herself when she nodded in agreement, because no one can pretend a private army doesn't exist. But when she thought of the girl lying in room 714, she decided that perhaps tonight the truth mattered less than keeping her safe. Vincent stepped through the door of room 714 after Lorenzo nodded to confirm that everything was secure, and in that instant, all the cold control he had built over the past 20 years seemed to collapse before the sight of the woman lying motionless in the hospital bed. The pale ceiling light fell over Scarlett like a merciless halo, exposing every wound on her fragile body without the slightest pity, and Vincent had to pause for a breath to force himself not to turn around and go hunt for Thomas Webb immediately. Her face was so swollen it was almost impossible to recognize the delicate features he had silently admired for 8 months. One eye darkened and puffed shut, her lips cracked with stitches running along the corner of her mouth, and bruises shaped like fingerprints circling her throat like a necklace of cruelty. He moved closer, each step heavy, as if wading through mud. And when he stood beside the bed, he saw what the first light had concealed. The cigarette burns scattered along her arms were not just a few as he had thought, but dozens. Some healed into pale scars, others still raw and red, evidence of years of torment she had endured alone in silence. Her left arm was in a cast from wrist to near the elbow, the fingers protruding swollen and bruised. And Vincent remembered how she had used that very hand to make coffee for him, those small fingers moving swiftly with the ease of someone who had done the job 1,000 times, now lying still, like withered petals. He pulled the hard plastic chair closer and sat without taking his eyes from her face, and in the stillness, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor, he felt something breaking apart inside his chest. He had killed for the first time at 17, a drug dealer who had betrayed his father, and since then he had ordered the deaths of countless enemies without losing a single night of sleep. Yet looking at Scarlett lying there, he felt as if he himself were the one being punished. He had failed to protect the only person he truly wanted to protect, and that failure hurt more than any physical wound he had ever suffered. Slowly he reached out, his fingers trembling as they touched the edge of the hospital blanket near her uninjured hand. He didn't dare touch her, afraid he would hurt her more, afraid that his presence might somehow bring her further misfortune. "I won't let this happen again," he whispered into the dimness, his voice hoarse as if the words were being dragged from the deepest place in his soul. "I swear to you, Scarlett, whether you want me near you or not, whether you know who I am or not, no one will ever touch you again. Never." The night passed in heavy silence. Nurses came and went to check on her a few times, but no one dared ask who the motionless man by the bed was. His cold gaze was enough to kill any question before it reached their lips. Vincent didn't sleep, didn't move. He only sat there watching Scarlett's chest rise and fall with each fragile breath, counting them as if he were using his will to keep her alive. He remembered the last time he had seen her, just 2 days earlier at Morning Bloom. She had smiled at him as she handed over his usual black coffee, a smile that never quite reached her eyes but was still warm enough to make his heart stumble. And now he understood that even then she had been hiding fresh bruises beneath long sleeves, carrying pain he had been too blind to see. When the first light of dawn began to slip through the curtains, Vincent was still there, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep yet sharp to every second. And in his mind, the plan for Thomas Webb was complete in every detail, a plan in which death would be far too gentle a reward for the man who had dared to touch his woman. About 20 kilometers south of Mercy General Hospital, inside the Suffolk County holding facility, Thomas Webb sat hunched on a freezing metal bench, telling himself over and over that this was only a misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up. He had been arrested around 11 the previous night when a neighbor called the police after hearing screams and crashing sounds coming from his house. And when the 2 officers arrived, they found Scarlett unconscious at the foot of the stairs with blood flowing from a wound on her head. He had explained that the girl had fallen on her own, that she was clumsy and always getting hurt. But the old and new bruises covering her body told a very different story, and before he could even understand what was happening, the handcuffs had snapped shut around his wrists. Now, sitting in the communal holding cell waiting for arraignment, Thomas still believed everything would be fine. He had slipped out of situations like this before thanks to a brother-in-law who worked in the police department, and he had no reason to think this time would be any different. The cell was nearly empty at this hour, only him and a drunken man snoring in the far corner, the flickering fluorescent light on the ceiling casting strange shadows across the gray concrete walls. Thomas was thinking about what he would say to his lawyer when the steel door creaked open with a harsh metallic sound, and 3 men were led inside by a guard whose face was as expressionless as stone. They didn't look like ordinary criminals. Thomas realized that instantly. The way they moved, the way they surveyed the room, the way their eyes swept over him, with the precise focus of predators locating prey, all of it radiated a danger he had never seen before. The first man was large, with shoulders as wide as a doorway and hands covered in scars. The second was thin, with eyes as cold as ice, and the quick, controlled movements of a snake ready to strike. The third looked almost polite, with neatly combed hair, and a prison uniform that somehow still looked pressed. Yet, it was that very politeness that made him the most frightening of all. The guard locked the door and disappeared without a word, and Thomas had the unsettling feeling that he had just been left inside a lion's cage. Thomas Webb, the polite man, spoke first, his voice carrying the tone of someone educated and accustomed to power. "We've heard a great deal about you, especially about what you like to do with your wife's daughter." Thomas's heart stumbled at those words. He tried to stay calm, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Who are you people?" he asked, trying to sound firm, and only earning a knowing glance between the 3 men. "I have a right to a lawyer. You're not allowed to threaten me." The large man laughed, a low, cold sound that echoed through the concrete room like something rising from hell. "A lawyer," he repeated with faint amusement. "You think a lawyer will save you, Thomas Webb? You think the law will protect you after what you've done to that girl for 15 years? Thomas felt the blood in his veins turn to ice as he realized that these men knew. They knew everything. Not only about last night, but about all the years he had hidden. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Thomas Webb understood what real fear truly was. The polite man pulled the bench opposite closer, and sat down with the relaxed air of someone preparing to tell a long story, while the other 2 stood on either side like statues guarding the gates of hell. "Do you know the name Vincent Moretti, Thomas?" the man asked in a tone as mild as if he were talking about the weather. Yet it was that very mildness that made Thomas shiver more than any open threat ever could. "Moretti." Thomas repeated the name with confusion. He had heard it somewhere before, in reports about organized crime, in the fearful whispers of people in Boston when they spoke about the underworld. But he didn't understand what it had to do with him. "Oh, you know that name," the thin man said with a smile like a blade. "Then you should also know that Vincent Moretti is the most powerful man in the entire Northeast. A man who only has to nod to make a senator lose his seat, a police chief lose his job, and men like you simply disappear without a trace." Thomas felt cold sweat slide down his spine. Even though the cell was freezing, he wanted to ask why a mafia lord would care about him, a dull suburban accountant, but the answer already hovered in his mind like the ghost of his own sins. "The girl you've been beating for 15 years. The large man leaned so close Thomas could smell tobacco and something like dried blood on his breath. "She caught Mr. Moretti's attention. And last night, when you brought her into the hospital half dead, You officially stepped into the sights of a man who never forgives and never forgets." "No," Thomas stammered, his throat dry as a desert. "The girl, I mean Scarlett, she's only my wife's daughter. I don't understand what she has to do with that man." The polite man sighed, as if explaining something simple to a slow child. "You don't need to understand, Thomas. You only need to know that from this moment on, your life no longer belongs to you. It belongs to Mr. Moretti, and he will decide whether you live or die, whether you suffer or find peace." Then they began to tell him stories. Stories of those who had dared anger Vincent Moretti, and how they ended. A traitorous businessman found hanging in his own office with a contract stuffed into his mouth. A corrupt politician who died in a car accident when his brakes mysteriously failed on the highway. A human trafficker sent to federal prison who survived only 3 days before being stabbed to death in the showers. But the most frightening stories were about men who abused women, because according to them, Vincent Moretti had a special rule for that kind of person. In prison, they said, in voices low as funeral bells, men who beat women and children are treated in a very special way. The other inmates consider it a sacred duty to teach them a lesson, and when Mr. Moretti sends word inside that lesson becomes a curriculum that lasts for years. They described what happened to men like Thomas in prison. The long nights dragged out of bed, meals poisoned just enough to cause pain, but not enough to kill, mysterious injuries appearing that no one ever saw being inflicted. And Thomas began to tremble, his whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm, as the picture of his future rose before him. "Please," he heard himself beg and hated the weakness of it, but couldn't stop. "I have money. I can pay. Please tell Mr. Moretti I'll do anything." The 3 men looked at each other with the satisfied glance of those who had completed the first step of their task, and the polite man nodded slowly as if weighing the offer. "Anything," he repeated with a smile cold as a Boston winter. Those are words Mr. Moretti very much likes to hear. Dawn had fully claimed the Boston sky when Lorenzo stepped into room 714, carrying a black leather briefcase and a look of gravity that Vincent immediately understood as bad news. He nodded slightly to his boss, then glanced at Scarlett still lying motionless on the bed, her steady breathing showing she was deep under sedation, and that allowed Lorenzo a quiet breath of relief because what he was about to say was not something she should hear. "The report is complete, sir," Lorenzo said softly as he set the briefcase on the table beside the bed and opened it to reveal a thick stack of documents with photographs and copied police records. "And what we found is far worse than we initially expected." Vincent rose from the chair where he had sat all night, his body stiff from hours without movement but his eyes still sharp as a blade as he looked at the files. "Thomas Webb didn't just abuse Scarlett," Lorenzo continued, his voice lowering as if holding back his own anger. "He has at least 5 victims before her, 2 former girlfriends from his college years, an ex-wife he divorced 18 years ago, that ex-wife's daughter, and a female colleague at the accounting firm where he works." Vincent picked up the photographs and looked into the faces of women who had endured the same hell as Scarlett, some now older with fear still etched into their eyes, some younger but carrying wounds of the mind that would never heal. And his fingers tightened until the paper nearly crumpled. "Why was he never prosecuted?" Vincent asked, though he already knew the answer, his voice flat in a way that was more frightening than anger, like the surface of a lake before a storm. "His brother-in-law," Lorenzo replied and pointed to a photograph in the file. "Officer Richard Webb, with the Boston Police Department for 25 years. Every time a complaint was filed against Thomas, the paperwork mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses suddenly changed their statements, and the victims were intimidated into withdrawing their reports." Vincent turned the next pages and found the timeline his investigators had carefully built. A timeline of brutality stretching over more than 2 decades that the law had deliberately ignored. "And Scarlett?" he asked, and his voice caught just slightly on her name. "When did he start doing this to her?" Lorenzo was silent for a moment, and that silence was heavier than any answer. "When she was 12, sir," he finally said, "just after her mother died of cancer. Medical records show she was admitted to hospitals 7 times over the past 15 years, with injuries explained as accidents, but doctors noted suspected domestic abuse in most cases. Nothing was ever done because Richard Webb always showed up to smooth things over. 15 years. Vincent repeated the words as if trying to swallow poison. "She's only 27. That means she's lived in hell for almost half her life." He turned back to Scarlett, to her bruised face and fragile body, and now he understood why her smile always carried a sadness that never faded. Why she flinched at sudden movements, why she hid her body beneath long sleeves even on the hottest summer days. "I want every other victim found," Vincent ordered, his voice back to its familiar coldness, though Lorenzo could sense the fire burning beneath. "Give them whatever they need. Money, lawyers, protection. And if they want to testify against him, make sure they're absolutely safe. And what about Officer Richard Webb? Lorenzo asked. He's on leave and we've located him. Vincent didn't answer at once. He looked down at Scarlett's casted hand and thought of the 15 years of suffering she had endured while the system meant to protect her had turned away. Make sure he never wears that uniform again, Vincent said at last. And make sure he knows exactly why. 12 hours had passed since the three men entered Thomas Webb's cell. 12 hours of horrifying stories, of threats whispered like lullabies sung by death itself, and of a waiting more terrifying than dying. And Thomas was no longer the confident man who had walked into the holding facility the night before, but only the hollow shell of that person. His eyes sunken from lack of sleep, his face gray with fear, his hands shaking uncontrollably like those of someone with a severe illness. And the polite man, whom Thomas now understood was only one of countless agents serving Vincent Moretti, gently placed a thick stack of documents on the metal table in front of him, as if offering a gift, and said, "This is your only chance, Thomas. 17 pages of detailed confessions of everything you've done, not only to Scarlett but to all the other women over the past 20 years. You'll sign every page, and we'll record the entire process, so you can't take it back." And Thomas stared down at the papers with clouded eyes, knowing that signing meant condemning himself, meant years in prison, meant the end of the life he had known. "But if I sign," he asked, in a hoarse voice dry with fear, "what happens then?" And the large man stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder, making him shrink like a wounded animal, and said slowly, "So Thomas would understand every word that if you sign, Mr. Moretti, we'll make sure your time in prison is merely unpleasant instead of unbearable. You'll be beaten but not killed, humiliated but not completely destroyed. That is a mercy you don't deserve, but one Mr. Moretti is willing to grant." "And if I don't sign?" Thomas asked, even though he already knew the answer. And the thin man smiled, the coldest smile Thomas had ever seen, and said, "If you don't sign, we'll leave you alone here. But Mr. Moretti's message will spread through the prison system before you ever see a judge, and what awaits you will make hell look like a summer holiday." And Thomas looked into those icy eyes and knew this was not an empty threat, but a promise. A future he couldn't escape if he refused. So he took the pen placed beside the documents, his hand shaking so badly he could barely control it, and began to read the words describing his own crimes. The first page, about the two girlfriends from his college years. The slaps, the punches, the drunken nights when he vented his rage on them. The second through the 5th pages describing the failed marriage to his ex-wife and her daughter. The years of violence he had hidden with the help of his police brother-in-law. And the heaviest part from the 6th page to the 17th, 12 pages detailing the 15 years of hell he had inflicted on Scarlett. From the first slap when she was 12, to the beating that nearly killed her the night before. And when Thomas signed the final page, he realized tears were running down his face, not tears of remorse but the tears of a coward finally forced to face the consequences of his actions. And the polite man collected the documents with satisfaction while the thin man turned off the phone camera that had recorded everything, and said as if concluding a business deal that Mr. Moretti will be very pleased and Thomas Webb welcome to the rest of your life. 3 days passed like an endless nightmare, and through all that time Vincent barely left room 714 except when Lorenzo forced him to eat or change his clothes. The doctors said Scarlett was recovering better than expected, that youth and hidden strength were helping her body fight the severe injuries, but they couldn't say exactly when she would wake from the drug-induced sleep. Vincent sat there counting her breaths, watching every small change in the swelling of her face, and praying to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in to give her one more chance. Then on the afternoon of the 3rd day, as the pale gold light of a Boston autumn slipped through the narrow gap in the curtains, Scarlett's eyelids began to tremble. Vincent sat upright, his heart pounding as he watched her slowly open her eyes, the warm brown eyes he had missed for 3 days now blinking in the unfamiliar light of the hospital room. She stared at the ceiling first, confusion clear on her face as she tried to piece her memories together. Then her gaze drifted sideways and settled on the man sitting beside her bed. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice rough as sandpaper from days of silence. And Vincent felt his heart break and heal in the same instant when she spoke the false name he had used for 8 months. He reached for the glass of water on the bedside table, gently lifted her head, guided the straw to her lips, and watched her take small, careful sips with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. "Where am I?" Scarlett asked, after she had drunk enough to ease her dry throat. What happened? And as memory returned like shards of broken glass stabbing into her mind, her eyes widened with primal fear. "Thomas," she whispered. He pushed me down the stairs. I remember falling and then everything went black. Vincent took her uninjured hand and squeezed it lightly as if trying to pass his strength into her. "He can't touch you anymore, Scarlett. You're safe now. He's been arrested and he'll never be free again." But instead of the relief Vincent expected, panic flared across Scarlett's face as she tried to sit up, ignoring the pain tearing through her broken ribs. "Lily," she almost cried. "My sister. If Thomas is arrested, who will take care of Lily? She needs medication. She needs health insurance. She'll die without the surgery." Vincent gently but firmly placed a hand on her shoulder and eased her back down before she could hurt herself further, and looked straight into her tear-filled eyes. "Lily is safe," he said slowly and clearly so she would hear every word. "She's at the best private medical facility in the city, with doctors caring for her around the clock, and her heart surgery has been scheduled with the leading specialist in the field. All the costs have been taken care of. You don't need to worry about anything." Scarlett looked at him as if he were speaking a language she didn't understand. Doubt and hope battling across her face in a war she didn't know which side would win. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling as her eyes searched his for answers. "Why are you doing all this? You're just a regular at the cafe. Why do you care about me and my sister so much?" Vincent knew this was the moment he could keep lying, could maintain the gentle Marcus mask she had grown used to. But looking into her eyes, pleading for truth, he realized he no longer wanted to hide. "There's a lot I need to tell you, Scarlett," he said, his voice softer than anyone who knew Vincent Moretti would believe he was capable of. "But first you need to rest and recover. I promise I'll explain everything when you're strong enough to hear it." The days that followed drifted by in a haze of painkillers and broken sleep. Yet Scarlett began to notice the strange details her dulled mind had first overlooked. Every time she opened her eyes, Marcus was there, sitting in the chair beside her bed or standing by the window looking out, and she wondered how a regular customer from a cafe could abandon his life for days, just to watch over someone who was almost a stranger. But what truly stirred her suspicion was not his constant presence. It was what she saw beyond the hospital door whenever it opened. There were men standing guard in the hallway. Not the familiar blue uniformed hospital security, but men in black suits with the posture of soldiers, their eyes sweeping over everyone who passed as if searching for threats. Scarlett noticed that whenever a nurse or doctor entered the room, they inclined their heads to Marcus with a respect bordering on fear that no one ever showed an ordinary cafe customer. She began to listen to the murmured conversations outside the door, trying to piece together fragments of information like a puzzle with no picture to guide her. Then one evening, when Marcus stepped outside to speak with a salt-and-pepper-haired man she recognized from having seen him several times before, she heard the thing that changed everything. A young nurse hurried past the doorway and nearly collided with Marcus, and she stammered an apology with visible trembling. "Sorry, Mr. Moretti. I didn't see you." "Moretti." Scarlett repeated the name in her mind, and suddenly the room seemed to spin around her, though she lay still in bed. She had lived in Boston for 27 years. She had heard that name in news reports about organized crime, in the fearful whispers of people speaking of the underworld, in urban legends about a mafia boss who controlled half the city. Vincent Moretti, she remembered. The man the police wouldn't touch, the man politicians bowed to, the man whose name alone made the hardest men shiver. And that man had sat in her small cafe for 8 months, ordering black coffee and leaving generous tips, pretending to be a normal man called Marcus, while in truth he was the most feared figure in the entire Northeast. Scarlett turned her gaze to the window where city lights flickered like fallen stars, trying to absorb the truth without letting panic drown her. Why would a mafia lord care about a cafe manager? Why would he invest time and money to protect her and her sister? And most of all, what did he want from her? The door opened and Vincent Moretti stepped inside, his eyes finding her at once as if by instinct, and when their gazes met, she knew he had realized she knew. The silence between them was heavy as lead, and Scarlett understood that though she was facing the most dangerous man she had ever met, she didn't feel afraid. She felt only an aching need to hear the truth, the whole truth, no matter how frightening it might be. Vincent closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment with his back against the cold wood, watching Scarlett with the eyes of a man preparing for a battle he wasn't sure he could win. "Who are you?" Scarlett asked directly, her voice so calm it surprised him. "Who are you really, and why did you lie to me for 8 months?" Vincent stepped closer, pulled the familiar chair toward him and sat down. But this time he didn't take her hand. He didn't touch her, because he felt he no longer had the right to, until she knew the truth. "My real name is Vincent Moretti," he said, his voice low, and even as if he were reading out his own sentence. "I'm 36 years old, and I stand at the head of what people call a mafia organization that controls most of the underworld activity in the northeast of the United States." He paused, waiting for a scream, waiting for her to press the call button for a nurse, waiting for horror in her eyes, but Scarlett only looked at him with a strange attentiveness, as if she were trying to read hidden pages inside his soul. "I've done terrible things, Scarlett," Vincent went on when her silence stretched on. "I've ordered people killed. I've destroyed the lives of those who dared to oppose me. I've built an empire on fear and violence, and I can't change any of that past." "Then why?" Scarlett asked. "Why would someone like you care about a girl who makes coffee? Why would you spend 8 months pretending to be a regular customer when you can have anything you want with a single nod?" Vincent felt as if someone were tightening a fist around his heart as he tried to put into words feelings he had buried for 20 years. "I saw you for the first time 8 months ago," he began, his voice softening in a way even Lorenzo wouldn't have recognized. "I stopped at your cafe purely by chance, because it was on the way to a meeting, and when you handed me that cup of coffee with that smile, a smile that was tired and sad yet still warm enough to make me forget who I was, I knew I was in trouble." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lost in night, where thousands of people were living their lives without knowing that the most feared mafia boss in the region was confessing love like a teenage boy. "I came back the next day, and the day after that, and so on for 8 months, Vincent continued. "I ordered coffees I didn't need. I sat for hours just to watch you work, to hear your laugh, to feel as if the world wasn't completely dark the way I had always believed." Scarlett said nothing, only listened, her eyes never leaving his shadowed back against the window. "I had Thomas Webb investigated," he went on, his voice hardening when he spoke the name, but his record was clean. His police brother-in-law had done an excellent job covering every trace, and I was foolish enough to believe you were only carrying the burden of caring for a sick sister. I didn't see the truth right under my nose. He turned back to face her, and in the dim hospital light, Scarlett saw something she hadn't expected. Real pain in the eyes of the man the entire city feared. "When I got the call that night saying you were in the hospital with severe injuries," Vincent said, and his voice broke as if each word were tearing his throat apart, "I felt as if someone had driven a knife into my chest and twisted it. I had failed to protect the only person I truly wanted to protect, and I swore I would never let that happen again." He walked back to the chair, sat down, and looked straight into her eyes with a sincerity he had never given anyone in his adult life. "I'm not asking you to forgive what I've done or what I am," he said. "I only want you to know the truth. And once you know the truth, you have the right to decide what you want. If you want me to disappear from your life, I'll do it. You'll still be protected. Your sister will still be cared for. But I'll never appear before you again if that's what you want." The silence after his words stretched like a string pulled so tight it was about to snap, and Vincent sat there, a man who had ordered executions without blinking, now waiting for judgment from a 27-year-old woman with broken ribs and a shattered heart. Scarlett looked at Vincent for so long that he began to think she had chosen not to speak at all, and that her silence would be her answer. A door quietly closing between them. But then she did something he hadn't expected. She didn't scream. She didn't call for security. She didn't look at him with the horror he had prepared himself to face. Instead, she only sighed and asked a question that caught him completely off guard. "Thomas," she said, her voice strangely calm, as if they were discussing the weather instead of the man who had tortured her for 15 years. "You said he'll never touch me again. What did you do to him?" Vincent studied her face, searching for fear or revulsion, but all he saw was a cool curiosity and something deeper, darker, smoldering in the brown eyes that had once known only gentleness. He signed a full confession. Vincent answered, choosing truth because she deserved it. 17 pages, detailing every crime he committed, not only against you but against every other woman before you. We have video of him admitting everything, and that confession will make sure he never sees daylight as a free man again. "Other women," Scarlett repeated, and Vincent saw her fingers tighten around the edge of the blanket, as if holding back a rage that had been locked away too long. "How many?" "5 before you," he replied honestly. 2 former girlfriends, an ex-wife, her daughter, and a colleague. All abused by him, and all silenced by his police brother-in-law, Richard Webb. Scarlett closed her eyes and Vincent saw a single tear slide down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of weakness. It was a tear of release, of 15 years of suffering finally being acknowledged as real. "I wasn't the only one," she whispered as if speaking to herself. "All those years I thought I had done something wrong. I thought I deserved it because I wasn't good enough, or obedient enough, or perfect enough to please him. But it turns out he did this to many others." Vincent wanted to reach for her, to take her hand, to pull her into his arms and tell her none of it was her fault, but he held himself back because he didn't know whether his touch was still welcome after everything he had revealed. Then Scarlett opened her eyes and looked straight at him, with a gaze he had never seen in her before. No longer the eyes of a frightened victim, but of a woman who had walked through hell and survived. "He deserves it," she said, her voice carrying a new hardness like steel tempered in fire. "He deserves everything that will happen to him in prison, and I hope he lives long enough to feel every single day of that sentence." Vincent looked at her with astonishment, and something like pride rising in his chest. The fragile girl he had quietly protected for 8 months was transforming before his eyes into a woman with a spine of steel and an unbreakable will. "You're not a good man," Scarlett continued, her gaze never leaving his. "You've told me about the things you've done, and I'm not naive enough to think that's all. But you know what? For 15 years I lived with a man the world thought was decent, while in truth he was a monster. So maybe I no longer believe in the world's definitions of good and evil." She paused as if weighing what she was about to say. Then she extended her uninjured hand and held it open at the edge of the bed like an invitation, like a permission Vincent hardly dared believe was real. "You protected me when no one else did," she said softly but firmly. "You took care of my sister when I couldn't, and you gave me something I never had before, a choice. So don't disappear. Vincent Moretti, at least not yet." Vincent looked at the hand she had laid open on the edge of the bed. A small invitation, yet one that carried more weight than any multi-million-dollar contract he had ever signed, and he slowly reached out and placed his hand over hers, feeling the warmth of her fragile skin flow into his calloused fingers like a gentle current. "You need to know this isn't a decision you have to make right now," he said softly, his thumb unconsciously tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "You've just been through a severe trauma, both physical and emotional, and I don't want you to decide anything while your mind isn't completely clear." Scarlett squeezed his hand lightly in a silent reply, and Vincent felt his heart begin to race in a way it hadn't for anyone in 20 years. "But I want you to know that whatever you choose," he continued, "you'll have choices, real choices, not the dead ends you've been forced into your whole life." He drew a deep breath as if preparing to step off a cliff, and began to lay out the paths he could open for her. "The first option," he said, "if you want to leave everything behind, leave Boston, leave your past, leave me as well. I can give you a completely new identity, a passport, a driver's license, a credit history, everything. You can go anywhere in the world and start over with enough money that you'll never have to worry about finances again. Lily will go with you, and her surgery will be done by the best doctors wherever you choose to settle." Scarlett listened in silence, her eyes never leaving his face as if trying to read what he wasn't saying. "The second option," Vincent went on, "if you want to stay in Boston and keep a normal life, continue managing your cafe or do whatever you want, I'll make sure you're protected from a distance. You'll never see my people, but they'll always be there. And I'll keep my distance. You won't have to see me again if that's what you want." He paused, and Scarlett sensed there was a third option he was hesitating to name, as if afraid that saying it aloud would make her think he was trying to push her. "And the third option?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying a curiosity she didn't try to hide. Vincent looked into her eyes, and in that moment he was no longer the cold Mafia boss the city feared. He was only a man standing before the woman he loved with his heart exposed and vulnerable. "The third option," he said, his voice dropping like a confession, "is to step into my world, to live under my direct protection, to become part of the empire I've built. You'd have everything money and power can buy, but you'd also face darkness, danger, and moral compromises that someone as good as you might never accept." He loosened his grip on her hand as if afraid he was holding her too tightly, asking too much. "I don't expect you to choose the third option," he said honestly. "In fact, I think you should choose the first. Leave everything behind and start a new life without me, or the past following you. That's what a smart person would do." "But I'm not smart," Scarlett replied, and for the first time since she had woken up, a small smile appeared on her scarred lips. "I'll think about your options, but I need time, and I need to see Lily before I make any decision." 2 days after that conversation, when the doctors confirmed that Scarlett was stable enough to travel a short distance, Vincent arranged to take her to the private medical facility where Lily was being cared for. The convoy of 3 black SUVs moved through the cool autumn streets of Boston, and Scarlett sat in the back seat beside Vincent, staring out the window without truly seeing anything, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions about her sister. The facility they arrived at looked unlike any hospital Scarlett had ever seen, more like a grand estate than a place of treatment, with carefully trimmed gardens and classical architecture that made her feel as if she were stepping into a different world altogether. Vincent helped her out of the car, one arm lightly around her waist to support her because her ribs were not yet healed, and led her down a corridor so pristine it seemed to glow beneath the soft lights. When the door to room 32 opened, Scarlett saw Lily sitting on the bed reading, and her heart shattered into a million pieces when her 19-year-old sister looked up and her face lit with the purest joy. "Scarlett," Lily cried and jumped from the bed, running toward her sister so fast that a nearby nurse had to remind her to be careful with her heart. They embraced, Scarlett crying without sound as she felt her sister's thin but warm body in her arms, and Lily cried too, her tears falling on Scarlett's shoulder like spring rain. "I was so worried," Lily whispered into Scarlett's ear. "They told me you'd had an accident, but I knew that wasn't the truth. I knew it was Thomas. I always knew he would do something terrible one day." Scarlett held her tighter, guilt rising in her chest as she thought of all the years she had tried to hide the truth from Lily, tried to protect her innocence from the darkness of their home. Then Lily lifted her head, her eyes traveling over Scarlett's shoulder to Vincent standing quietly by the door, and to Scarlett's surprise there was no fear in her gaze, only curiosity and something like gratitude. "It's him, isn't it?" Lily asked softly. "The man who sent people to protect us." Scarlett turned to Vincent in surprise, then back to her sister, the question clear in her eyes. "I saw them," Lily explained. "The men outside my apartment, in the cafe across from where you work, in the hospital when I went for my regular checkups. They thought I didn't notice, but I knew they were there. I knew someone was protecting us, even if I didn't know who or why." Scarlett looked at Vincent and saw him staring down at the floor like a boy caught doing something he hadn't wanted to admit. "She knew," he said quietly with a rare trace of embarrassment. "I tried to keep them hidden, but it seems your sister is sharper than I thought." Lily stepped closer to Vincent, her small frame like a doll beside the tall man, and did what none of Vincent's 400 men would ever dare do. She took his hand. "Thank you," Lily said simply. "Thank you for protecting my sister when no one else did. And thank you for giving me the chance to have surgery. I don't know who you are or why you did all this, but I know you're a good person no matter what the world thinks of you." Vincent stood there with Lily's small hand in his, and for the first time in his life, the feared Mafia boss of the Northeast didn't know what to say. That night, Scarlett lay in the familiar hospital room with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling while her mind wandered through 15 years of painful memories like a film with no stop button. She remembered the day her mother died, the hollow feeling of standing beside the coffin at 12 years old, and realizing she would have to face the world alone from then on. Not knowing that hell was only just beginning, she remembered Thomas's first slap, the way he apologized afterward and said he was only tense because of the funeral, the way she believed him because she was too young to understand that an abuser's apologies are worth nothing. She remembered the years that followed, the nights she cried alone in her room with an aching body, the mornings she covered bruises with makeup before going to school, the lies she told her friends about falling down the stairs or bumping into a door. She remembered Lily, her little sister born with a fragile heart, the one she had sworn to protect at all costs, and how that vow became the chain that bound her to that house of hell for so many years. Because Thomas controlled Lily's medical insurance, she remembered the times she wanted to run, the times she stood on a bridge looking down at the dark water and wondered if death would be easier than living, and how the image of Lily always pulled her back, reminding her someone still needed her and she wasn't allowed to fall. And now, after 15 years of endurance, she lay here with broken ribs and a shattered heart. Yet strangely, she didn't feel despair the way she once had. Instead, she felt a fire burning inside, a fierce desire not to escape anymore, but to never have to escape again. She thought about the 3 options Vincent had given her, about a new life with a false identity in a distant city, about returning to her old life with protection from afar, and then about the 3rd option, stepping into his world, stepping into the darkness he had warned her about. And she realized she wasn't afraid of the dark because she had lived in darkness for 15 years already. The darkness of Thomas Webb was worse than anything the underworld could offer, and at least in Vincent's world, she would no longer be a helpless victim. When the first light of dawn slipped through the gap in the curtains, Scarlett had made her decision, and a strange peace filled her, as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Vincent entered the room at 7 in the morning, as he did every day, carrying coffee and pastries from the place she loved. And he stopped when he saw her sitting up against the pillows with a brightness in her eyes he had never seen before. "I've been thinking all night," Scarlett said before he could speak, "about the choices you gave me, about my life, about who I want to become." Vincent set the breakfast down and stepped closer, with his heart beating faster from a worry he didn't want to admit. "I don't want to disappear," Scarlett continued, her voice steadier than it had ever been. "I don't want to run ever again. I've been running for 15 years and it gave me nothing but pain." She looked straight into Vincent's eyes, and he saw there, not the fragile girl she once was, but a woman being reborn from the ashes of her past. "I want to be strong," she said. "I never want to feel helpless again the way I did when Thomas hit me. I want the power to protect myself and the people I love. And if your world can give me that, then I'm willing to step into it." Vincent looked at her. The woman he had loved from a distance for 8 months. The woman he had believed would flee from him once she knew the truth. Now standing before him, choosing his world with open eyes and a fearless heart. "Are you sure?" he asked, with a voice rough from emotion. "This isn't a decision you can take back. Once you step into my world, you can never fully return to a normal life." "I've never had a normal life," Scarlett replied with the first small smile he had seen since she woke. "So I have nothing to lose and everything to gain." 1 week after Scarlett made the decision that changed her life, the doctors finally agreed to discharge her on the condition that she continue to rest and return for regular checkups to monitor the healing of her ribs. That morning, as Scarlett stepped out of the main doors of Mercy General Hospital with Vincent at her side and Lily holding her hand on the other, she couldn't help being stunned by the sight waiting for her. 12 gleaming black SUVs were lined up along the road in front of the hospital, engines already running, men in black suits standing rigid beside each vehicle like silent sentinels. Scarlett looked at Vincent with surprise and confusion, and he only shrugged with a rare small smile on his usually cold face. "You're part of the organization now," he said quietly, "and the organization protects its own with everything it has." The convoy moved through the fresh autumn morning streets of Boston, Scarlett sitting between Vincent and Lily in the third vehicle, watching through the window as the city she had lived in for 27 years slowly slipped away behind her like the closing of an old chapter. They left the city center, passed through green suburbs where the houses grew fewer and more elegant, until the convoy turned onto a private road guarded by a massive iron gate and 2 checkpoints staffed around the clock. Vincent's estate appeared before Scarlett like a fairy tale castle. 3 stories of classical European architecture, tall white columns, perfectly trimmed gardens stretching on every side, and a marble fountain at the center of the front courtyard. Lily couldn't contain a small cry of wonder at the sight of what would become their new home, her eyes wide as she tried to take in every detail. Their old apartment could have fit into one corner of this place, and Scarlett felt a strange dizziness as she stepped through the massive oak doors inside. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Polished marble floors, paintings Scarlett guessed were original works by famous artists, enormous crystal chandeliers casting warm light from high ceilings, and a grand spiral staircase leading to the upper floors. Yet what surprised Scarlett most was not the luxury, but the unexpected warmth of the space. The sofas looked soft and inviting. The fireplace crackled gently, and there was even a reading nook with wooden shelves reaching to the ceiling filled with books. "I've had rooms prepared for both of you," Vincent said as he led them upstairs. "Lily's room is on the 2nd floor near the medical staff on duty, so they can help immediately if she needs anything. And your room, Scarlett, is on the 3rd floor next to mine, but if that makes you uncomfortable, I can arrange something else." Scarlett met his eyes and saw the genuine care behind the cold exterior he showed the world, and she shook her head softly. "I'm fine with that," she said, surprised to realize that she truly was. Lily ran off eagerly to explore her new room, her footsteps echoing down the hall like a cheerful melody the house perhaps hadn't heard in a very long time. Scarlett stood by the window of her room looking down at the vast gardens where gardeners were trimming hedges, and she realized that for the first time in 15 years she was breathing without feeling a stone on her chest. She was looking toward the future without fear. This was her new life, strange and frightening in a completely different way from anything she had known, yet full of promise and possibility. And when Vincent came to stand beside her in silence, she knew she had made the right choice. The first days at the estate passed in a strange blend of luxury and unease, Scarlett slowly adjusting to a room 10 times larger than her old one, to meals prepared by a private chef, to the courteous staff who bowed slightly whenever she passed. Yet there was one thing money couldn't buy, and that was peaceful sleep. On the first night, she woke at 2 in the morning with a scream caught in her throat, her silk nightgown soaked with sweat that someone had thoughtfully placed in her new wardrobe, her heart racing as the image of Thomas with his fist raised still burned in her mind. She sat upright, gasping in the unfamiliar darkness, trying to remind herself that he was in prison now, that he couldn't touch her anymore. But her body refused to listen to reason. It still trembled as if waiting for the next blow. Then she heard a faint sound outside the door, a small noise like someone shifting in a chair, and instead of fear she felt a strange curiosity pull her from the bed toward the door. When she opened the heavy oak door, she saw Vincent sitting in an armchair just outside her room, his head tipped back slightly, and his eyes closed, as if he had dozed off while keeping watch. He woke instantly at the sound of the door, his sharp gaze sweeping over her in a second to make sure she wasn't hurt before softening when he saw her standing there in a wrinkled nightgown with her hair in disarray. "You can't sleep," he said, an observation rather than a question, and Scarlett nodded, not bothering to ask how he knew because her muffled cry had surely carried through the wall no matter how hard she had tried to hold it in. She also didn't ask why he was sitting here in the middle of the night instead of sleeping in his own room only steps away, because she was beginning to understand that this was how Vincent showed care, not with words but with actions, with quiet presence that asked for nothing in return. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying in her dream. "I don't think I can go back to sleep, and sitting alone in the dark is making me lose my mind." Vincent rose without a word, followed her inside, and sat in the armchair by the window while she climbed back into bed, curling beneath the blankets like a child seeking safety. They began to talk, at first only small questions about each other's lives, then gradually deeper as the night created a kind of shelter that made secrets easier to release. Vincent told her about his childhood, about the father who was killed before his eyes when he was 13, about how he had been forced to grow up overnight and turn pain into strength to take revenge and build the empire his father had begun. Scarlett told him about her mother, about the happy days before she died, about how she used to sing her to sleep every night, and say that one day Scarlett would find a man who loved her enough to protect her from all the darkness in the world. They spoke of shattered dreams, of invisible scars that hurt more than those on the skin, of the loneliness of people who have to be strong while they are breaking inside. And when dawn began to tint the sky outside the window, Scarlett realized she had stopped trembling without noticing, that Vincent's presence had driven away Thomas's shadow in a way no lock or wall ever could. She rose from the bed, stepped to where he sat by the window, and did the thing she hadn't believed she had the courage to do. She leaned down and placed a light butterfly kiss on his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for not leaving when things became hard. Thank you for showing me that not all men are like Thomas." Vincent sat frozen as if that small kiss had turned him to stone. Then he lifted his hand to touch the place where her lips had been, and Scarlett saw in his eyes something she had never seen in anyone looking at her before. Respect, tenderness, and a love so deep it almost took her breath away. 3 months passed like a dream. 3 months in which Scarlett slowly learned to live again instead of merely exist. 3 months in which the wounds on her body healed, and the wounds in her soul began to mend, under the patience and gentleness of the man the world called a monster. Then the day of Thomas Webb's trial finally arrived. A cold winter morning with light snow whitening the streets of Boston as if nature itself were trying to cover the ugliness about to be revealed. Scarlett stood before the mirror in her room and looked at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. No longer the thin girl with frightened eyes and hastily hidden bruises, but a woman with a steady gaze and the upright posture of someone who had walked through hell and survived. Vincent entered and stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders in the mirror. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he said softly. "No one is forcing you to face him again." But Scarlett shook her head. She needed to do this. She needed to look Thomas Webb in the eye one last time and say what she had carried inside for 15 years. She needed to close that chapter so she could truly move forward. A convoy of 8 black SUVs took them to the Suffolk County Courthouse, where reporters and onlookers had gathered outside because the case had drawn media attention after the identities of the other victims were released. Scarlett entered the courtroom with Vincent beside her and Lorenzo behind. She took a seat in the front row and felt the eyes of everyone in the room turn toward her. But she didn't care. She focused only on the side door where Thomas would be brought in. When he appeared, Scarlett almost didn't recognize the man who had tormented her for so many years. Thomas Webb was now only the shadow of the person who had once terrified her. So thin his prison clothes hung loose on him, his eyes hollow with dark circles like someone who hadn't slept for weeks, his posture bent as if he had been completely broken. He didn't dare look at her, his gaze fixed on the floor as if one wrong glance might bring some terrible consequence. And Scarlett understood that Vincent's people had kept their promise. 3 months in prison had taught Thomas Webb a lesson the law never could. The trial moved more quickly than Scarlett had imagined. Thomas pleaded guilty to all 17 charges, including aggravated assault, systematic domestic abuse, child abuse, and several others, his voice trembling and almost inaudible as he spoke. The judge sentenced him to 25 years without parole, and applause rose from the other victims seated in the back rows. But before Thomas was led away, Scarlett stood, her voice carrying through the courtroom without a microphone. "I would like to say a few words to the defendant, Your Honor." The judge nodded his permission, and Scarlett stepped close to Thomas, close enough that he had to lift his head and look into her eyes for the first time since that fateful night. "You took 15 years of my life," Scarlett said, her voice clear and steady like a bell. "You took my childhood, my confidence, my faith in people, and you almost took my life." She paused, looking into eyes that had once been full of cruelty and were now only hollow pits of fear and despair. "But you failed," she continued. "You didn't take my soul. You didn't take my ability to love and trust. And you certainly didn't take my future. Because I'm still here. I'm still standing, and I will live a life you can never imagine while you rot in prison." She turned and walked away without looking back at the man who had once been the greatest nightmare of her life. And when she returned to her seat beside Vincent, she felt a massive weight lift from her shoulders, as if 15 years of suffering had finally been released in those words. 6 months after the trial, Scarlett's life had changed in ways she would never have dared to dream of during the darkest years of her existence. Lily had undergone a brilliantly successful heart surgery at Boston's leading private hospital, where the best doctors in the country worked for 8 straight hours to repair the congenital defect she had carried since birth. And now Lily was preparing to enroll at one of the most prestigious universities in the Northeast with a wide-open future ahead of her. Scarlett stood on the balcony of Vincent's penthouse, looking down at the busy city of Boston, glowing beneath her in the golden light of sunset, and wondered whether the 27-year-old woman with broken ribs lying in a hospital bed that night could ever have believed she would be standing here. Today, she was no longer the small cafe manager anymore, because over the past 6 months, Vincent had taught her everything about his empire, both the legitimate parts like the restaurant and luxury hotel chains, the real estate companies and the investment funds, and she had proven herself a quick learner with a sharp business mind that even Lorenzo found impressive. She heard familiar footsteps behind her and felt Vincent's warmth as he came to stand beside her, his arm slipping around her waist with a tenderness shown only to her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, his voice low and warm beside her ear like a lullaby. Scarlett turned and looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her in every sense of the word, the man who had shown her that even in the deepest darkness there could still be light, and she smiled. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," she said. "A year ago, I was a voiceless victim without power and without hope, and now I'm standing above the city with the most powerful man in the Northeast." Vincent bent and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, carrying with it a promise of a future they would build together. "You're not just the queen of this empire," he whispered. "You're the queen of my heart, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be afraid again." Scarlett rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat of the man the world called a monster, but who to her was a guardian angel, and she knew she had found where she belonged. She had once been a victim, but now she was a survivor. She had once been imprisoned in another person's darkness, but now she had learned to master her own. And anyone who dared touch her or those she loved would quickly understand why the entire city feared the name Moretti. The story of Scarlett and Vincent had come to an end, but the lessons it carried would endure through time. This was a story about human strength in the face of adversity, about how it's never too late to find yourself again, and about how love can bloom in places where there seems to be no light at all. If you're going through a difficult time in your life, remember that darkness doesn't last forever, and sometimes salvation comes from where we least expect it. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with those you care about. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the heartfelt stories we bring you every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel, whether it made you think about the people around you, or whether you've ever witnessed someone overcome similar hardship. Please leave a comment sharing what's in your heart, because we read every one and treasure each of your thoughts. And finally, we wish all of you watching this video good health and a life filled with joy and happiness